So the raw materials we're using are clay, which we've actually got in a dry form, but if you dig it fresh from the earth it's quite often quite claggy, and straw. And again, we often save the straw that we've trimmed off the walls, and that's quite good for making a long straw mix for packing out. And just water, which we can wash our clay hands in. So to make the slip coat, really all you need to do is start off with your dry clay and put some of that into the bucket. When you put dry clay, when you put water into dry clay, it usually fizzes, and then we put a little bit of water in with it, not too much, and mix it up. So we need quite a bit more clay into this mix. This is clay that we've got from a local brickworks. It's called milled clay. We've worked with it quite a lot, and we know how much of everything we need to add to our recipe to make it work. Obviously, when you're making lots of this stuff, you can use a plaster mixer. I'm just showing you what we're after, mixing by hand. To get it nicely mixed up, and you would generally mix it and then leave it overnight. What you end up with is this lovely rich slurry mix, which is just right then for our key coat to put on the walls. Now if you're doing a whole building, you might want to get a few old metal baths and mix up in there, because you will need a lot of quantity of clay to do a whole building. But surprisingly, not so much as you might imagine. Probably a ton of clay would do a building about 30 square meters in floor area. So from this slip we then make all our other mixes. So when you're first working with a new clay, you need to do test patches with it to find out how much sand and how much fibre you need to add to it, which is a whole course all in itself. But basically the ingredients of a good plaster are clay, sand and fibre, and for the fibre we use either chopped straw or we use hemp, and they all have their different properties. The clay is the binder that sticks everything together. It also gives a colour if you're using it as a finish coat. The sand gives it strength so that it will be durable and you can knock it and it won't disintegrate. And the fibre holds it all together and gives it tensile strength and can also act as a decorative finish. So together with our clay and sand and straw, we end up with a plaster that looks like this. So this is a mixture of sand and fibre and clay, which is what we're going to put on the walls for the body coat. Here we've got exposed straw, which needs its first coat of clay slip, the key coat. And the slip is a nice, quite sticky, slurry consistency. And we don't want to take too much at a time because you'll waste it, because we don't need an awful lot on here. You sort of rub it on and rub it off again. You can see how it squashes the straw down. So that's the sort of thing that we want here. So I'm just taking a little bit at a time and rubbing it in and squashing the straw down. So you see how that's transforming that quite loose looking bundle of straw. It's transforming it now into a surface that we're going to be able to plaster. And I'm trying to make sure that all the straw is covered, and I'm also tidying it up, ready for my next key coat. And what happens when you do this is that a wall that seemed really nice and flat, suddenly you realise that it's got some hollows in it from where the two bales have come together. And you very often get that sort of thing where you've been cutting out around the fixing post, because the ears of the straw bale are quite difficult to keep nice and regular at that point. So I'll just make sure I've got enough slip all the way over, and especially down into the edges like this. You actually get very, very fast at this. I'm obviously just going slowly to show you how to do the process, but you can do this really, really quickly. It's also possible to get this clay slip-on using a spray gun, and then you have to have somebody who's using the spray gun and a couple of other people working behind, rubbing it in and scraping it off. But that again can speed the process up if you have the right equipment, but it's not necessarily what you want to be doing on a self-build straw job. So now with my clay slip, I'm ready to do the next stage of the preparation process, which is to deal with these sorts of hollows and holes. So what we've got here is a mixture of the slip and some straw, and they're just mixed up together into a nice sticky mass, so that all the straw is completely covered with clay and it will stick together nicely like a sculptural piece. And with this we can simply push it in to all the hollows, making sure that it makes contact with the surrounding surfaces. And you can see already that we're starting to fill out all those problematic holes using very cheap, straightforward materials, so that we can start making the shape that we want. Now, this long straw mix and the clay slip ideally should be made the day before you use them, because the clay wants to really get soaked well into the water in the mix, so that it's completely gone through the whole part of the straw, so that all the straw is soaked in clay. So you can also see that with this method you can also start doing sculptural work. So if I want to have this as a nice round corner, I can make that with my long straw mix. I can make whatever shape I want, and I can also start thinking about making alcoves, making frescoes on the wall, making eyebrows over arches. And once you start working with this, you see just how easy it is to make all sorts of shapes in the straw, not just to make your straw flat, ready to put plaster on it, but also to give it a sculptural, organic feel. And once you start realising what you can do with the clay, people get very excited. And most straw bale houses have very individual aspects to them of sculptural work done with straw and clay all over the place. In little places you'll see little geckos, or you might see rabbits, all sorts of things you'll find that individualise a home and a workplace, because you can. What we've got here is a very good example of what a straw bale wall looks like after it's had its very first key coat or slip coat of clay added to it. So you can see the shape of the straw, you can even see where the bales go, and this has been done with just a slurry coat of wet clay with nothing else added. It needs to be rubbed well in, which is why using tools generally doesn't work very well. The loose straw is quite flexible, so when if you use a trowel on it and rub it in, the straw tends to flick it back at you. So these are the most appropriate tools for working on clay, with clay onto straw walls. And you rub it in, and you make sure that each piece of straw is coated with the clay. And if there are any undulations that are really quite big, you can fill those undulations in with a mixture of this stuff mixed with straw, so that you get a straw clay mix to fill out any holes. And this key coat is really the most important part of the process. So with this process, you're trying to make the wall as flat as possible. We've already trimmed it with our strimmer or with our alligator saw, and now we're giving it a key coat. So it's really quite solid. If you can hear that, it sounds quite solid. And once it's dried, we're ready to do our second coat of clay. You need to damp down the first coat. The first coat must be completely dry, because that way you're then sure that the clay has penetrated right to the back and has dried. And then when you come to do your second coat, you want to damp it down so that it becomes a little bit sticky again, because clay works by gripping onto something. It's not like lime or cement. It needs a rough surface, and it needs a little bit of stickiness with the undercoat in order to catch itself. And then once it's wet, you would generally damp it down and then come back again in half an hour or so and damp it down again until it was feeling quite sticky to the touch. Then you come along with your body coat, which is this lovely stuff here. And I like to put this on by hand, because you can really get it rubbed well in when you do it by hand. And that's the idea. This is the action. You want to rub it in and make sure that it's making a strong bond between this coat and that coat. You can do this process using conventional tools, but certainly if you've not done plastering before, although this is slower, you'll find that you can actually get it to stay on the wall more easily. And as time goes on, you might get used to using tools with it. So what we're after with this coat is to get a finish on that has a body, a thickness, and also starts looking like how we want it to be when it's finished. So that means that we don't follow the undulations of the straw so much, but we're actually trying to make it quite flat. Unless, of course, you want a building that has got a lot of undulations in it. And for this process, you can flatten it off with tools, so a wooden trowel would be good. You can also just use a piece of wood, damp it down in the water, and with this you can start getting a smooth finish on it. So you wouldn't do more than that at this point. Now you leave it to dry quite a lot before you do anything else with it. If you want to put a finish coat onto the top of this, which would be a very thin coat, maybe 3 or 4 millimeters thick, there's a lot of companies that will produce finish coats in fine plasters in beautiful colours. And again, you would wait for this coat to go completely dry, and then once it was completely dry, you'd go through the same process and put your finish coat of plaster on top. Now you see how I've left this, you can see them where I've dragged the wood through the surface. Now I could choose to leave that as a decorative finish, or if I want to put a finish coat on, I need to leave it as rough as that so that the finish coat can actually grip onto it when I come to do that. One of the things that can be quite disconcerting when you're using clay plasters is that because they have got some organic material in them, as they dry, if they dry quite slowly, you might get some powdery sort of mould growing on it. You might also sometimes get sprouting from the straw underneath. Now that really is not a problem, and it's to be expected. We've had whole walls that have bloomed with a white furry mould, but once the clay has dried completely, that doesn't come back. And it's something that you have to take on board when you're working with natural materials, is that they don't do the same things as proprietary materials, and you have to work with the nature of it, but there's nothing untoward about that. So you can see just from this little panel that I can easily make this wall, which is quite undulating, I can, if I want to, I can make it completely flat, and I could make it look like a gypsum plaster wall if I wanted to. Now I can't understand why anyone would want to do that when you've got the option, but I could do that, and this whole building could change from looking like a rustic workshop to looking like a very professional porter cabin. But let's not do that. Under here we've got blocking between the rafters so that nothing can get into the roof space, and we've already trapped the hessian between the timber of the roof and that blocking piece, so that this, we can then wet this hessian and cover it in clay slip, fasten it down, and we can smooth it into the clay slip coat, the key coat, onto the straw as we go. That little bit of detail saves us an enormous amount of time and fiddliness trying to do it later. So if you remember from the wall plate when we built the building, up here at the top of the wall is a wooden plate which you can't see now because we've used this hessian, and we've completely covered the wood with the mesh of this fibre hessian. And what we did with the hessian was we soaked it in the clay slip. So the same material that's covering the body of the wall, we soaked the sacking, the hessian, the jute, in that. It was attached to the timber at the top underneath the shelf, and we've brought it down into the body of our wall so that it covers the join between the wood and the straw. And you need to do something like that, in modern terms that's called a scrim, to cover the joints between two different materials. So that would be between the wood of the wall plate and the straw of the wall. It might also be between the straw and the plastic strapping that's holding the roof down, and it might be covering electrical cables or plumbing pipes, anything that you've got buried in the body of the wall, just so that you don't get cracking at that area when you do your body coat and your finish. So if you want to put a wood burning stove into your straw bale building, there's really no problem about it. And as long as you follow building regs about fireproof materials, you'll be fine. So in this particular building, for instance, we've reinforced the floor underneath the area where the stove is going to go. There'll be a big stone hearth laid here. Behind, we've fixed a fireproof board, which is fixed very handily onto wooden battens that are connected to the timber of the base plate and to the timber of the wall plate. You can see where it's fixed through those vertical battens. Before we put this board in place, we plastered the straw underneath with clay to give it an extra fire protection. And you can see in the ceiling we've cut out a hole, an oval shape, ready for the stovepipe to go through the roof once we're ready to install the stove. And the main consideration when you're putting a stovepipe in is that you need to leave at least 50 mil, 2 inches, between the double insulated pipe of the stove and any combustible material, whether that's wood or whether that's straw.